This is what happened during the 9 days in August 1945 when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria with 1.5 million men, and Japan's own government split 3-3 over whether to surrender at all. 2 cities were destroyed in 72 hours, and an empire that had never lost a war in its modern history ended it not with a single decisive blow, but with a deadlocked council, a midnight vote by an emperor who almost never spoke, and a failed coup that came within hours of erasing the surrender before it was ever broadcast. By September 2, 1945, the war was over. 6 weeks earlier, the men who ran Japan's government couldn't even agree on whether ending it was acceptable. And to understand how those 6 weeks collapsed into 9 decisive days, you have to start 4 years earlier, in a New Mexico desert, with a weapon that didn't exist yet. The atomic bomb began as a $6,000 research appropriation in 1939, and by 1945 it had become the most expensive weapons program in American history, roughly $2 billion, close to $2.2 billion once every associated site gets counted, the equivalent of somewhere around $28 to $30 billion today. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed around 130,000 people, and most of them had no idea what they were actually building. Over 80% of that money never went toward bomb design at all. It went into building and running the industrial plants that produced fissile material at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. Oak Ridge alone housed roughly 75,000 residents by May of 1945, a small city that materialized almost overnight to enrich uranium for a weapon most of its workers weren't cleared to know about. Put that $6,000 starting figure next to the $2 billion final one, and the growth curve is worth sitting with for a second. That's roughly a 300,000-fold increase in 6 years, funded almost entirely through classified appropriations kept hidden even from most of Congress, let alone the public. That final figure made the Manhattan Project, in inflation-adjusted terms, comparable in scale to some of the largest infrastructure programs in American history. And it was built not over a decade of public debate and open contracting, but in secret, under wartime urgency, with almost no public accountability at all until after the weapon had already been used. The project had 2 military heads, in effect. Major General Leslie Groves ran it day to day, while J. Robert Oppenheimer ran the design laboratory at Los Alamos, where 2 entirely different bomb designs were being pursued at once, a uranium gun-type device and a plutonium implosion device, because nobody was certain which one would actually work. Groves ran the Manhattan Project the way a modern supply chain executive would recognize instantly, with parallel path development, redundant production lines, and a refusal to bet the entire program on one unproven technology. 2 designs, built simultaneously, so that if one failed, the other might not. It's the same risk logic Silicon Valley calls hedging your bets across a portfolio, except the portfolio here was 2 different ways to end the deadliest war in human history. While Los Alamos worked, Japan was already strategically finished, even if it hadn't surrendered yet. The United States Navy had thrown a blockade around the home island so effective that Japan's engineers were building some aircraft partly out of wood, because there wasn't enough metal to spare, and an aerial mining campaign called Operation Starvation had choked off the sea lanes Japan depended on for oil, iron ore, and food. Government surveys taken in April of 1945 reported that ordinary Japanese citizens were, in the words of that survey, too preoccupied with the problem of feeding themselves to focus on the war at all, and the 1945 rice harvest would turn out to be the worst since 1909. Then came the bombing campaign. Major General Curtis LeMay's B-29s had, by mid-1945, burned out roughly half the urban housing across 67 Japanese cities, and the single worst night came on March 9th and 10th, 1945, the Tokyo firebombing, codenamed Operation Meeting House. 279 B-29s dropped roughly 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs and burned out about 16 square miles of the city in one night. Somewhere between 80 and over 100,000 people died, and close to 1 million more were left homeless. By most historical accounts, it remains the single most destructive air raid of the entire war, more immediately lethal than either atomic bombing would turn out to be. None of that broke Japan's government. Japan's military leadership was still committed to a plan called Ketsugo, a decisive, bloody defense of the home islands designed not to win the war outright, but to inflict enough American casualties that Washington would negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. That single strategic assumption, that Japan could still bargain its way to acceptable terms through resistance, is the thread running through almost everything that happens over the next several months. It's worth pausing on just how strange the Manhattan Project's own internal logic was, because it explains a lot about the decisions that followed. Groves and Oppenheimer weren't just building one bomb. They were racing two unproven physics problems to completion at the same time, under a security architecture so compartmentalized that most of the 130,000 people working on the project had no idea what the end product even was. Workers at Oak Ridge separated uranium isotopes in enormous electromagnetic plants without necessarily knowing why, and workers at Hanford produced plutonium in nuclear reactors built specifically for that purpose, in a stretch of Washington state chosen for its isolation and its access to the Columbia River for cooling water. Neither uranium enrichment nor plutonium production had ever been done at industrial scale before 1945, and both had to work essentially on the first real try, because there wasn't time or material for extensive trial and error. That urgency mattered because of the calendar. Germany surrendered in May of 1945, and the original justification for the crash program, beating Nazi Germany to a working atomic weapon, had already evaporated by the time Trinity was tested in July. Ending the Pacific War was the only justification left standing by the summer of 1945. Meanwhile, the pressure on ordinary Japanese civilians was compounding by the week. The blockade wasn't a single event. It was a slow strangulation that had been tightening since early 1945, cutting off the oil, rubber, and iron ore. Japan's war economy depended on almost entirely from overseas sources. Operation Starvation, the aerial mining campaign against Japanese harbors and shipping lanes, made even domestic coastal transport dangerous, and by mid-1945, Japan's merchant marine, the fleet of civilian cargo ships that moved food and raw materials between the home islands, had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war tonnage. High-altitude jet stream winds over the home islands scattered bomb patterns, and much of Japan's wartime industrial production was dispersed into small workshops and home-based manufacturing rather than concentrated in easily targeted factories. LeMay's answer was to abandon high-altitude precision bombing in favor of low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raids, trading bombing accuracy for sheer volume of fire directed at Japan's densely built, largely wood and paper urban housing stock. That shift, from precision that wasn't working to volume that would, mirrors a decision logic familiar in fields far removed from strategic bombing. When a targeted, high-precision approach underperforms against a complex, distributed system, the response is often to abandon precision altogether and instead maximize sheer coverage, accepting far more collateral effect in exchange for a result that actually moves the needle. It's the same trade-off modern epidemiologists reference when comparing targeted contact tracing against broad population-level interventions during a fast-moving outbreak, since precision works beautifully against a concentrated, well-understood target and breaks down against a diffuse one. Japan's dispersed, workshop-based wartime industrial base was exactly the kind of diffuse target precision bombing wasn't built for, and LeMay's shift to area incendiary raids amounted to an admission that the existing doctrine wasn't equipped to solve the problem in front of it. The March 9th and 10th Tokyo raid was the first full demonstration of that new doctrine, and its results, a single night more immediately lethal than either atomic bombing that would follow it 5 months later, effectively became the new standard operating procedure for the rest of the war. By the time Hiroshima was bombed in August, mass urban destruction on this scale was no longer a shocking exception in the Pacific Air War. It had become routine, and that routineness is itself part of why the atomic bombings didn't produce an immediate, unified shift in Japan's government position the way a modern audience might expect. Japan's leadership had already absorbed the destruction of dozens of cities by conventional means without capitulating. And from inside the Ketsugo strategic framework, a single new type of bomb, even one this uniquely destructive, didn't automatically read as categorically different from the mass urban destruction Japan had already been enduring for months. What it actually took was the specific combination of 2 atomic strikes in 3 days, a Soviet invasion overnight, and the collapse of any remaining diplomatic options, all arriving together to force the issue to a head. Inside Washington, the decision about how and whether to use the new weapon ran through 2 bodies. The Interim Committee, chaired by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, advised on policy, while the Target Committee, working under Groves, picked the cities. On May 31, 1945, Oppenheimer and the rest of the scientific panel, Enrico Fermi, Ernest Lawrence, and Arthur Compton among them, advised against staging a harmless technical demonstration of the bomb instead of using it on a real target, because they didn't believe a demonstration would carry enough weight on its own. That single recommendation closed off what, in hindsight, is one of the most frequently raised counterfactuals about this entire episode. Why not simply demonstrate the bomb's power somewhere unpopulated and let that alone force Japan's surrender without killing any civilians? 4 of the era's most credentialed nuclear physicists, the very people who best understood what the weapon could and couldn't do, considered that option directly, in an official advisory capacity, and rejected it. Their stated reasoning was that a demonstration carried real risk of failure, given how untested some of this technology still was in May of 1945, and that even a successful demonstration might not carry enough psychological weight on its own to break Japan's military leadership out of its committed defensive strategy. Whatever conclusion anyone draws about the decision that followed, it wasn't reached without that specific alternative being formally considered and set aside by the scientists closest to the technology itself. Stimson's own position inside this story is worth understanding on its own terms, because he shows up twice, in 2 very different roles, within the space of a few weeks. As chair of the Interim Committee, he was one of the senior officials most directly responsible for advising Truman on whether and how to use the bomb at all, a policy-level, strategic role. Weeks later, in the Kyoto decision, he acted in an almost opposite capacity, as the one senior official willing to personally override his own military planners on a specific targeting choice, based on cultural and historical grounds rather than military logic. The same man who helped set the overall policy authorizing the bomb's use also personally vetoed its use against what may have been the single most militarily convenient target on the entire list, and that combination says something about how Washington's wartime decision-making actually worked in practice, not as a single, unified strategic logic, but as a series of individual judgment calls made by a small number of specific people, each layering their own priorities on top of the broader policy. It's worth naming the full shortlist, because saying Hiroshima was chosen makes the process sound more deliberate and singular than it actually was. The Target Committee's shortlist moved through several cities: Kokura, Hiroshima, Yokohama, Niigata, and for a while, Kyoto, for separate cities evaluated and re-evaluated across multiple committee meetings, with the single most contested decision, Kyoto's removal, settled only by Stimson going over Groves's head directly to the president. Kyoto was actually the preferred target on military-industrial grounds. Stimson personally took it off the list. On May 30th, he told Groves to strike Kyoto from consideration. Groves pushed back since Kyoto had real military-industrial value, and Stimson took the disagreement straight to Truman, who backed his Secretary of War. Stimson cited the city's historical and religious significance. Groves tried to get Kyoto reinstated in July. Stimson refused again, and on July 25th, Nagasaki was substituted onto the target list in Kyoto's place. There's a popular story that Stimson spared Kyoto because he'd honeymooned there. It makes a good story, but it isn't true. Historian Alex Wellerstein has traced Stimson's familiarity with the city to an official visit he made in the 1920s, while serving as Governor-General of the Philippines, not a honeymoon. Groves' own files, meanwhile, contained a target map of Kyoto with an aiming point already selected, evidence of just how close the city came to a different fate. 2 weeks before that final target decision, on July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the Manhattan Project detonated the first nuclear weapon in human history in the New Mexico desert, the Trinity test, in the Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man. Estimates of the yield vary by source, generally landing somewhere between 20 and 25 kilotons, with some sources placing it as precisely as 25 kilotons plus or minus 2, and others citing a rounder figure closer to 20 or 21. It worked, the first confirmation, after roughly 6 years and $2 billion of effort, that the physics the Manhattan Project had been racing to industrialize actually functioned as a deliverable weapon and not merely a laboratory theory. 3 weeks. That's the gap between that confirmation and the first combat use. Trinity succeeded on July 16th, and Hiroshima was struck on August 6th, meaning the United States moved, in the span of 3 weeks, from proving this weapon could work once in a controlled desert test to using an entirely different, never-before-tested version of it on a city of over 300,000 people. That compressed timeline is itself part of what made the decision-making process so consequential, because there was very little room, between the test and the first use, for extended deliberation, second-guessing, or gathering additional evidence about the weapon's actual effects before committing to its use against a real target. Within days, President Truman, then at the Potsdam Conference outside Berlin, meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, told Stalin on July 24th that the United States possessed, in his words, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He didn't specify what it was, and Stalin, who already knew about the bomb through Soviet espionage, reportedly showed little reaction. 2 days later, on July 26th, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of what it called prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. The Soviet Union, not yet at war with Japan, didn't sign it. Japanese Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki responded publicly with a single word, mokusatsu, which translates roughly as to kill with silence, or to treat something with silent contempt. Whether that was meant as outright rejection or simply no comment, while we deliberate, remains debated by translators to this day, but Washington read it as rejection. That single-word ambiguity makes for a striking case study in how a translation choice can carry consequences on a historical scale most modern communication never has to reckon with. Mokusatsu can plausibly be read as we're withholding comment for now, a holding position while Japan's own fractured leadership figured out how to respond internally, or as we treat this with contempt, a much harder rejection. American translators and news wire services in the days after Suzuki's statement rendered it closer to that second, harder meaning, and that reading shaped how Washington understood Japan's posture toward the Potsdam terms in the days immediately preceding the authorization to use the bomb. In almost any other context, that kind of ambiguity might simply generate a footnote in a translation studies journal. In this one, it sat in the small window of time between an ultimatum and the first use of a nuclear weapon in human history. On July 25th, the authorization order went out. Atomic bombs could be used against Japan any time after roughly August 3rd, weather permitting. Truman's own private diary from that same week, July 25, 1945, offers a window into how he was framing the decision to himself, days before the first bomb fell. He wrote that he had told Stimson to use the weapon so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors would be the target, not women and children, adding that the target would be, in his words, a purely military one. Historian Alex Wellerstein, who has studied this diary entry closely, has argued it suggests Truman may not have fully grasped what an atomic weapon detonated over a city center would actually do to that city's civilian population, that in his own mind, at least on paper, he believed he was authorizing something closer to a conventional military strike than an attack that would kill tens of thousands of civilians within its first minute. 16 hours after Hiroshima, when the bombing was publicly announced, Truman's statement, released by the War Department and drafted before he'd even left Potsdam, read in part that an American airplane had dropped one bomb on Hiroshima 16 hours earlier, and that if Japan did not now accept the Allied terms, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on this earth. That statement doubled as both an announcement and a threat, correctly implying that a second bomb was already available and that more could follow if Japan's leadership continued refusing the Potsdam terms. To understand what unconditional surrender actually meant as a sticking point, it helps to connect a few threads usually treated separately: the Potsdam Declaration's language, the Interim Committee's internal debates, and Japan's own constitutional structure. Japan's 1889 constitution treated the emperor as a sacred, quasi-divine figure, not merely a head of state, but the symbolic and spiritual center of the entire national structure. An unconditional surrender, as worded in the Potsdam Declaration, made no explicit promise about what would happen to that institution. For Japan's civilian leadership, Suzuki, Togo, and Yanai, the entire question of whether to accept Potsdam's terms came down almost exclusively to a single, unresolved variable: whether accepting would mean the abolition of the imperial system itself. That ambiguity kept the government from responding decisively to Potsdam throughout the last days of July, even as American planners moved forward with authorization to use the bomb. Here's a number most retellings skip entirely. The invasion alternative being weighed against all of this had wildly different price tags depending on who you asked. A Joint War Plans Committee study from June 15, 1945 estimated an invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, would cost somewhere between 132,000 and 220,000 American casualties, 27,500 to 50,000 of them dead or missing. A separate estimate Stimson commissioned, from physicists William Shockley and Quincy Wright, put the number far higher, between 1.7 and 4 million Allied casualties, 400 to 800,000 of them dead, and 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths. When Truman later asked about an even higher figure, 500,000 to 1 million American lives, an estimate attributed to Herbert Hoover, General Thomas Handy called those numbers entirely too high. Lay those three estimates side by side, and the spread is almost impossible to reconcile. One official planning study measured likely American dead in the tens of thousands. A second commissioned estimate measured likely total deaths on both sides in the millions, and a third figure, floated informally and specifically rejected by a senior general as too high, sat somewhere in between. Truman wasn't working from a single, agreed-upon number when he weighed the invasion alternative against using the bomb. He was working from a range so wide it could be used, with equal sincerity, to justify almost any decision he ultimately made. These weren't casual guesses, they were competing methodologies, and it's worth being direct about why that spread existed at all. The Joint War Plans Committee's lower figure was built from operational planning assumptions about specific landing beaches, defensive positions, and expected attrition rates drawn from recent Pacific campaigns like Okinawa. The Shockley-Wright estimate Stimson Commission took a broader, more pessimistic view of Japanese civilian and military resistance across the entire home islands, closer to a worst-case scenario than an operational plan. Hoover's figure, the one General Handy dismissed as too high, wasn't a military planning estimate at all. It came from a former president weighing in from outside the military planning process entirely. Three very different kinds of numbers, produced by three very different kinds of authority, all circulating in Washington in the same weeks the atomic bomb decision was being finalized. Those estimates span an almost unbelievable range, from tens of thousands of American dead to figures 10 times higher. And that range is not a footnote. It's one of the central reasons historians still argue about what necessary even means in this story, because the honest answer depends heavily on which of those wartime estimates you believe Truman was actually weighing most heavily in the room. The two weapons that would eventually fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, physically, almost completely different machines, and that distinction explains a lot about why the missions themselves unfolded so differently. Little Boy, the weapon used on Hiroshima, was a gun-type device. Its design fired one piece of uranium-235 down a barrel into a second piece at high speed to force the mass past a critical threshold and trigger a chain reaction. It carried roughly 64 kilograms of uranium-235, of which less than 1 kilogram actually underwent fission, meaning the overwhelming majority of the weapon's fissile material never reacted at all. Because the gun-type design was considered mechanically reliable, Little Boy was never even test detonated before it was used on a real city. The first time anyone confirmed a uranium gun-type bomb actually worked was the Hiroshima mission itself. Fat Man, used on Nagasaki, was a completely different design, a plutonium implosion device built around a plutonium-239 core weighing roughly 6.15 kilograms, compressed to critical density by a precisely synchronized ring of conventional explosive charges detonating simultaneously around its surface. That design was considered far less certain to work, which is exactly why the Trinity test on July 16th used a device of the same implosion design rather than the gun type, since Los Alamos needed to prove the implosion concept actually functioned before committing a live weapon to a combat mission. The precision required for that implosion design has a modern engineering parallel worth naming. The explosive lenses ringing the plutonium core had to detonate within microseconds of each other, because even a small timing mismatch would compress the core unevenly and cause it to fail or underperform rather than reach critical mass cleanly. It's the same category of synchronization problem modern engineers solve today in contexts as varied as multi-engine rocket ignition sequencing and high-frequency electronic switching, where getting the timing wrong by a fraction most people would consider negligible causes the entire system to fail. In 1945, with none of the digital timing tools engineers rely on today, Los Alamos scientists had to solve that synchronization problem essentially from scratch, using analog detonators and explosive lens geometry worked out largely through trial, calculation, and the Trinity test itself as the final proof of concept. Hiroshima, in other words, was struck by a bomb design that had never been tested at all, on the assumption its underlying physics was simple enough to trust, while Nagasaki was struck by a bomb design that had been tested exactly once, 3 weeks earlier, in a New Mexico desert. At around 2:45 in the morning, Tinian time, on August 6, 1945, a modified B-29 took off from the Pacific island of Tinian. Its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had named the aircraft after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets, and the crew that day included Captain Robert Lewis as co-pilot, Major Thomas Farabee as bombardier, Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk as navigator, and Navy Captain William Deke Parsons, who armed the bomb, codenamed Little Boy, in flight after takeoff, to reduce the risk of a catastrophic accident on the ground. A tailgunner, Technical Sergeant George Bob Caron, and a radar countermeasures officer, First Lieutenant Jacob Baser, rounded out the crew, and Baser would turn out to be the only man to fly on both atomic strike missions. The aircraft belonged to the 509th Composite Group, and its planes carried a specific piece of tradecraft worth noting, deceptive tail markings mimicking the insignia of other, unrelated bomb groups, a Circle R, for instance, associated with the 6th Bomb Group, designed to mislead Japanese air defense intelligence about which unit was actually flying which mission. Days earlier, the cruiser USS Indianapolis had delivered Little Boy's uranium components and a partially assembled bomb core to Tinian, arriving July 26th, and within days of completing that delivery, the Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine, one of the U.S. Navy's worst single losses of the war, and a stark reminder of how close to the war's active edge this entire delivery chain was operating, even in its final weeks. The armed in-flight procedure Parsons used on Little Boy follows the same basic safety principle behind why modern commercial airliners don't fuel certain hazardous systems until they're needed, and why munitions today are still routinely transported in a disarmed or partially disassembled state and only made live immediately before use. It's a risk management logic that predates the atomic age by centuries, though the stakes of getting it wrong on August 6, 1945, were unlike anything that basic principle had ever been applied to before. A weather reconnaissance aircraft, straight flush, flew ahead of the main strike formation that morning specifically to confirm conditions over Hiroshima before the mission committed to it as the target, and that single reconnaissance report, clear skies, is effectively what sealed Hiroshima's fate as the city struck that morning. The same basic procedure, using the strike aircraft itself as its own weather scout, would be repeated 3 days later over Kokura, with a very different outcome. At 8:15 that morning, local time, Little Boy detonated roughly 1,900 to 2,000 feet above the city. Some sources say closer to 1,968 feet, about 550 feet from its intended aiming point at the Aoi Bridge, 43 seconds after release from around 31,000 feet. The device carried about 64 kilograms of uranium, 235, and less than 1 kilogram of it actually fissioned. Estimates of the yield vary. Physicist William Penny's post-war Manhattan Project survey put it at 12 kilotons plus or minus 1, while other sources place it as high as 15 or 16. Even at the low end of that range, it was enough. Hiroshima's population at the time was somewhere around 330 to 350,000 people, and the blast and the firestorm that followed consumed roughly 13 square kilometers, about 5 square miles, destroying an estimated 3/4 of the city. A thermal pulse lasting about 3 seconds burned exposed skin as far as 3.5 kilometers from the point of detonation. The death toll is one of the most contested numbers in this entire story, and the honest answer is that no single figure is definitive, because Japanese wartime records were destroyed and, in many cases, entire families died with no one left to report them. There's a further complication rarely mentioned in casualty discussions: an unknown number of forced laborers, many of them Korean, brought to Japan under wartime labor programs, were present in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the time of the bombings, and their deaths are especially difficult to account for in the historical record, since they often fell outside the systems Japanese authorities used to track their own citizens. Any casualty figure cited for either city should be understood as a serious, carefully researched estimate, not a precise count, and never a complete one. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation places deaths in Hiroshima somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000 within the first few months, while a more specific epidemiological study from the same organization, published in 2019, puts the figure closer to 140,000 dead by the end of 1945, roughly 40% of the city's population at the time. A separate estimate from Manhattan Engineer District records puts immediate deaths closer to 70,000, with another 100,000 dying over the following 5 years from bomb-related injury and illness. Cause of death broke down roughly 60% burns, 30% blast trauma, 10% radiation. Here's the detail that surprises most people. Long-term radiation deaths, tracked by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation from 1950 to 1990, were comparatively small next to the immediate toll, an estimated 850 deaths attributed to radiation-caused cancer, and another 400 to 800 from radiation-induced non-cancer injury. Radiation levels near ground zero returned to something close to normal within about a month. That single data point cuts directly against a piece of popular understanding worth naming outright. Many people assume Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained lethally radioactive wastelands for years or decades afterward, uninhabitable in the way some nuclear accident sites became, but the actual epidemiological record doesn't support that picture. The horror of Hiroshima was overwhelmingly a horror of blast and fire in the first hours and days, not of a poison landscape that kept killing for a generation afterward. The long-term radiation death toll, while real and carefully documented across decades of research, was measured in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands the immediate blast and firestorm had already claimed. Getting that distinction right matters, because conflating radioactive contamination with the primary cause of death misrepresents both what actually happened to the roughly 140,000 people who died in Hiroshima by the end of 1945 and what decades of subsequent research actually found. Roughly 280,000 people reported having been exposed to the bombing in Japan's 1950 national census, and over time, around 650,000 people have been officially recognized, at some point, as Hibakusha, bomb-affected survivors. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation, successor to the Wartime Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, has spent decades running what's called the Lifespan Study, tracking over 100,000 survivors and their health outcomes across their entire lifetimes. That single, multi-generational dataset became, and remains, the foundational body of evidence behind global radiation safety standards used today in medicine, nuclear power regulation, and occupational safety, an ongoing scientific legacy running in parallel with the human one, built entirely from what happened to the people who lived through Hiroshima and Nagasaki and consented, decade after decade, to be studied. For 2 days after Hiroshima, Japan's government did not surrender. Then, on August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov informing the Japanese ambassador at around 11 o'clock at night, Transbaikal time. 1 minute past midnight, now technically August 9th, Soviet forces crossed into Manchuria. This was Operation August Storm, and its scale is almost never mentioned in the same breath as the atomic bombings, even though it unfolded in the exact same window of time. According to the definitive U.S. Army study of the campaign by Lieutenant Colonel David Glantz, more than 1.5 million Soviet personnel, precisely around 1,577,725, across 89 divisions, attacked across 3 fronts, backed by roughly 5,500 armored vehicles and more than 26,000 guns. Facing them was Japan's Guandong Army, commonly cited at 600 to 700,000 men in Manchuria itself, over 900,000 counting Korea, but a shell of what it had once been. Its best units and heavy equipment had already been stripped away to reinforce the Pacific theater, leaving it with obsolete 1930s-era tanks and ammunition stockpiles sufficient for only a fraction of its divisions. Set those two numbers next to each other and the imbalance becomes almost absurd on paper. Roughly 1.5 million fully modern, fully equipped Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of guns, against a nominally larger Japanese force that had, in practice, been hollowed out into something closer to a garrison army than a modern fighting force, its best divisions, its best equipment, and its most experienced officers long since transferred out to fight the Americans in the Pacific instead. On paper, Japan still fielded more total personnel in the region than the Soviet invasion force. In practice, it was facing a fully mechanized, numerically comparable modern army with equipment roughly a decade out of date and ammunition reserves that couldn't sustain a prolonged defense. The Soviet advance moved at 50 to 80 kilometers a day, and the Guandong Army would be ordered to surrender within a week, on August 16th and 17th. The timing of that invasion wasn't a response to the atomic bombs at all. It had been set months earlier at the Yalta Conference, roughly 3 months after Germany's surrender in May. But the psychological effect on Tokyo, arriving in the same 72-hour window as Hiroshima, was enormous because it closed off the one diplomatic option Japan's government still believed it had, using a neutral Soviet Union to broker a negotiated peace. As of August 8th, that option no longer existed. Glantz, the U.S. Army historian who produced the definitive study of this campaign, specifically cautions against calling it a mere walkover, and it's worth being precise about something the general historical record doesn't always emphasize. Even against a hollowed-out Guandong army stripped of its best equipment, Soviet forces documented tenacious, sustained Japanese resistance in numerous engagements across Manchuria. This wasn't a symbolic gesture of an invasion. It was a full, brutal continental campaign, commanded by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky across 3 separate fronts: the Transbaikal Front under Rodion Malinovsky, the First Far Eastern Front under Kirill Meretskov, and the Second Far Eastern Front under Maxim Perkiev. The only reason it doesn't loom larger in most popular accounts of how the war ended is that it happened at the exact same moment as two atomic bombings, two single aircraft, single bomb events that are, understandably, far easier to compress into a documentary runtime than a 1.5 million-man, multi-front continental invasion unfolding simultaneously across thousands of miles of Manchurian terrain. Meanwhile, a second American strike aircraft, a modified B-29 called Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, with Captain Kermit Behan as bombardier, Captain James Van Pelt as navigator, and Commander Frederick Ashworth as weaponeer, was already in the air on the morning of August 9th, headed toward its primary target, the city of Kokura, home to a major Japanese arsenal. It never dropped its bomb there. Haze and drifting smoke, left over from a conventional firebombing raid on the nearby city of Yada the day before, obscured Kokura completely, and Boxcar made 3 separate bombing runs over roughly 50 minutes. Unable to get a clear visual sighting, burning fuel it didn't have to spare. A fuel transfer pump malfunction before takeoff had already stranded around 600 gallons on the ground. Running low, Sweeney diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki, and the near miss became so well known in Japan afterward that Kokura's luck entered the language as an idiom for unknowingly escaping catastrophe. Stack up the individual failures behind that diversion, and the margin of chance involved becomes almost uncomfortable to sit with. A fuel pump malfunction on the ground before the mission even began, smoke from an entirely separate, conventional bombing raid the previous day drifting over the actual intended target, and 3 failed passes burning through fuel reserves that were already compromised. None of those 3 things had anything to do with Kokura's residents, or with any decision made about them specifically. They were mechanical and meteorological accidents, arriving in sequence, that meant a different city, one that hadn't been the mission's actual objective that morning, ended up being struck instead. It's one of the clearest illustrations in this entire account of how much of what happened in early August of 1945 came down not to grand strategy, but to weather, fuel gauges, and timing. Nagasaki itself was cloud-covered when Boxcar arrived. The crew had been ordered to bomb visually, not by radar, and nearly switched to radar targeting before a break in the clouds let bombardier Kermit Behan sight the target in the final seconds. At 11:02 that morning, local time, Fat Man detonated roughly 1,650 feet above the city, about 502 meters, missing its intended aiming point by roughly 1.5 miles. The device carried a plutonium core of about 6.15 kilograms and produced a yield most commonly cited between 21 and 22 kilotons, more powerful than Little Boy, but with less destructive effect on the ground, both because of the targeting miss and because hills around the city shielded large sections of it from the blast. Nagasaki's population at the time was around 280,000. Roughly 6.7 square kilometers of the city, about 2.6 square miles, were destroyed. An estimated 60% of the city, a smaller footprint than Hiroshima's, largely because of that geographic shielding. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation places deaths in Nagasaki somewhere between 60 and 80,000 within the first few months, and a more specific 2019 epidemiological estimate puts the figure closer to 74,000 by the end of 1945, around 30% of the city's population. Boxcar, dangerously low on fuel after the mission, made an emergency landing on Okinawa with only around 7 gallons remaining. The geography that spared parts of Nagasaki is itself worth understanding, because it's the specific reason Nagasaki's destruction, while catastrophic, was proportionally less total than Hiroshima's. Nagasaki sits across a series of hills and valleys, unlike Hiroshima's comparatively flat river delta layout. Fat Man detonated over the Urakami Valley, in the northern part of the city, home to the Mitsubishi Armaments Works the mission had originally been aimed at destroying, and also, notably, to the largest Catholic cathedral in East Asia, Urakami Cathedral, which was devastated in the blast. The hills ringing that valley absorbed and deflected much of the blast wave that would otherwise have carried further into the city's southern, more densely populated districts. It's a grim irony of terrain. A bombing miss and a valley's natural topography together account for a meaningful share of the difference between Hiroshima's and Nagasaki's respective death tolls, even though Fat Man was, by yield, the more powerful of the two weapons. One detail from this window of the war deserves its own moment. A Mitsubishi Heavy Industries engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on business on August 6th, survived the blast, returned home to Nagasaki, and was there on August 9th when the second bomb detonated. He survived that too. In March of 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized him as the only person confirmed to have survived both bombings, a formal recognition that arrived nearly 64 years after the events themselves, an indication of how long it took even for a single, extraordinary case like his to be officially documented and acknowledged. Yamaguchi wasn't alone in that experience, even if he was the only one formally recognized by the government. A 2006 documentary, titled Twice Survived, The Doubly Atomic Bombed of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, identified as many as 165 people who may have experienced both attacks: commuters, business travelers, and Mitsubishi employees like Yamaguchi, whose work or family ties happened to span both cities in early August of 1945. That documentary was screened, notably, at the United Nations, a rare instance of independent Japanese survivor testimony filmmaking reaching that particular international stage, underlining how seriously the Niju Hibakusha, the double Hibakusha, experience came to be treated as a distinct category within the broader survivor community, decades after the war itself had ended. Most retellings compress the next part into a single sentence: Japan surrendered, but it's the part that actually decided how this war ended. Japan's war policy in August of 1945 ran through 6 men, formally known as the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, informally called the Big Six: Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, War Minister General Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Yamizu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Somu Toyota. On August 9th, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, that council met to decide whether to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, and they split exactly down the middle, 3-3. Suzuki, Togo, and Yanai were willing to accept Potsdam with a single condition: that the imperial institution itself, the position of the emperor, be preserved. Anami, Yamizu, and Toyota wanted 3 additional conditions attached: that Japan disarm itself rather than be disarmed, that Japan conduct its own war crimes trials rather than face Allied ones, and that there be no Allied occupation of the home islands at all. With 6 men locked at 3-3, the Council couldn't produce a decision, a deadlock arriving at the exact moment 2 atomic bombs and a Soviet invasion had converged on Tokyo within 72 hours. 3-3 understates the practical gap between those two positions, and it's worth sitting with exactly how far apart they actually were. Togo's single-condition position was, functionally, close to full acceptance of unconditional surrender, with one carve-out for the throne. Anami, Yamizu, and Toyota's 4-condition position, self-disarmament, self-conducted trials, no occupation, plus the throne guarantee, was closer to a negotiated peace between equals than to a surrender at all. Self-disarmament would have let the Japanese military stand down on its own terms rather than under foreign supervision. Self-conducted war crimes trials would have meant Japan investigating and judging its own military and political leadership, rather than facing an international tribunal, a structure that, if granted, would have looked nothing like what actually happened afterward, when Allied tribunals tried Japanese leadership directly. No occupation would have meant American and Allied forces never setting foot on the home islands at all, leaving Japan's existing government and military structure fundamentally intact. Prime Minister Suzuki chaired a council with 3 men effectively asking to lose the war on paper while conceding almost nothing on the ground, and 3 men, including Suzuki himself, willing to accept terms close to what unconditional surrender actually meant. That's not a minor procedural disagreement. It's two functionally different visions of what the end of the war should even look like, and it's the reason the decision ultimately required the emperor himself to step outside his constitutional role and break the tie directly. It was resolved that night, technically the night of August 9th into the 10th, at an imperial conference where Emperor Hirohito was asked, extraordinarily, to break the tie himself. This almost never happened, since the emperor's role was constitutionally symbolic, not decisional, but he gave what's remembered as his first sacred decision, Seiden, indicating he wished to accept the Potsdam Declaration on the single condition of preserving the imperial institution, aligning with Suzuki, Togo, and Yanai's position. On August 12th, the Allied reply arrived, sometimes called the Burns Reply, after Secretary of State James Burns, stating that the emperor's authority would be subject to the supreme commander for the Allied powers. It was, by design, ambiguous enough to be read as compatible with keeping the imperial institution intact, without explicitly guaranteeing it. The disagreement inside Tokyo didn't simply vanish because the emperor had spoken once, and between August 10th and 14th, War Minister Korechika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Yamizu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soma Toyota remained deeply uneasy about the ambiguous wording of the Burns reply, worried that being subject to the Supreme Commander could eventually mean the effective dissolution of the imperial system regardless of what Tokyo had been promised. Marquis Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and one of the emperor's closest advisors, worked throughout this period as a key behind-the-scenes advocate for accepting the terms and ending the war, a role that doesn't get the same attention as the Big Six themselves, but was instrumental in keeping the peace faction organized and in communication with the emperor directly. Kido's position illustrates how much of Japan's actual surrender process happened outside the formal Big Six structure entirely. As Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Kido held no military command and no cabinet portfolio. His authority was almost entirely personal and advisory, built on decades of proximity to the emperor rather than on any formal chain of command. Yet in the 4 days between the first sacred decision and the second, it was exactly that kind of informal, trusted access that kept the peace faction's position in front of Hirohito consistently, even while the military faction continued pushing its own case through the Big Six formal deliberations. Japan's surrender wasn't decided purely through the official council structure the Constitution laid out. It ran, in its final days, just as much through a small circle of personal advisors with direct, informal access to the one person whose word could actually break the deadlock. The council met again on August 14th, and the emperor reaffirmed his decision to accept. That evening, a recording was made of Hirohito reading a surrender rescript, meant for broadcast to the entire nation the next day. There's a quote from Navy Minister Yanai from around this time that reveals something about how Japan's leadership actually processed the decision internally. He said, in effect, that the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war were, in a sense, divine gifts, because they let Japan's leadership end the war without having to publicly admit that domestic collapse, not military defeat by any single blow, was the real reason. It's a strikingly modern piece of political framing, using an external, unstoppable event to provide political cover for a decision your own side is too divided to own outright, and governments do this today with everything from economic policy reversals to military drawdowns, finding the external shock and letting it carry the blame. Read Yanai's comment closely, and it does something more than explain Japanese political psychology in August of 1945. It quietly undercuts a piece of the traditional narrative that treats the bombs as a straightforward military knockout blow. Yanai, one of the 3 Big Six members who had favored acceptance all along, wasn't describing the bombs as the thing that defeated Japan militarily. He was describing them as the thing that let Japan's government stop pretending it hadn't already been defeated. That's a subtle but important distinction, and it's part of why this single quote gets cited by historians on more than one side of the broader necessity debate. It can be read as evidence that the bombs were decisive, or as evidence that the war was effectively already lost, and the bombs simply provided the political excuse everyone in the room already needed. The surrender was recorded on the evening of August 14th, and it almost never aired. That same night, a group of junior Japanese army officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, attempted to seize control of the Imperial Palace and prevent the broadcast entirely. They murdered Lieutenant General Takashi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guards Division, and forged orders in his name to move troops into position. Their goal was straightforward: find and destroy the phonograph recordings of the Emperor's surrender speech before they could reach the public and keep the war going. The mechanics of that plot are worth spelling out, since attempted coup can sound abstract next to the actual sequence of events. Hatanaka and his co-conspirators needed Mori's authority as the Imperial Guards commander to legitimately move troops to seal off the palace grounds and search for the recordings. When Mori refused to join them, they killed him and used his official seal to forge the orders they needed anyway, meaning the entire early phase of the plot ran on a fabricated chain of command, issued in the name of a man the plotters had just murdered. That's the level of institutional fracture Japan's government had reached in its final hours as a wartime state. A faction within the military willing to forge a dead superior's authority in order to override a decision the emperor himself had already made twice. The recordings had already been hidden, smuggled out to the national broadcaster NHK, while the coup attempt was still underway inside the palace grounds. The Eastern District Army, the regional military command that could have thrown its weight behind the coup and potentially changed its outcome, refused to join, and by dawn on August 15th, the attempt had collapsed. Hatanaka shot himself before noon that day, leaving behind a death poem that read, "I have nothing to regret now that the dark clouds have disappeared from the reign of the emperor." Consider the position War Minister Anami had occupied for days before that night. He was one of the 3 Big Six members who had pushed, right up through the emperor's second sacred decision on August 14th, for additional surrender conditions beyond simply preserving the imperial institution. Yet when junior officers inside his own ministry moved to stage an actual coup that same night, murdering the Imperial Guards commander and forging orders in a dead man's name, the army as an institution did not rally behind them. The Eastern District Army's refusal to join is the detail that actually decided the coup's outcome, because without that regional command's backing, Hatanaka's group controlled a palace, but not a country. It's one of the starkest illustrations of just how narrow the margin was between the war ending on August 15th and continuing indefinitely under a very different Japanese government. Most documentary treatments of this war skip the coup attempt almost entirely, or mention it as a footnote, and that's a mistake. For several hours on the night of August 14th, the actual mechanism of Japan's surrender, a physical audio recording, sitting in a specific location, guarded by a specific group of loyalists, stood as the single point of failure between the war ending and the war continuing under a military government that had just murdered its own Imperial Guards commander to prevent peace. Had those officers found the recordings a few hours earlier, the broadcast the next day may never have happened the way it did. At noon on August 15th, 1945, Japan Standard Time, the recording aired. It became known as the Jyoquan Hoso, the Jewel Voice broadcast, and for the overwhelming majority of Japanese citizens listening, it was the very first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice at all. Hirohito spoke in formal classical Japanese, a register so removed from everyday speech that many ordinary listeners struggled to follow it, and radio announcers had to clarify afterward what had actually been said. He never used the word surrender. What he said, in the most commonly cited English translation, was that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, one of history's more understated sentences, and that the decision had been made to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. He described the atomic bomb as a new and most cruel bomb. Multiple English translations of that broadcast exist, and they don't all render Hirohito's language identically, a reflection of how dense and formally structured the original classical Japanese actually was. What's consistent across every serious translation, though, is the indirection. Hirohito never says the words "we surrender," "we lost," or "the war is over." He describes a situation that has developed unfavorably and a duty to endure hardship for the sake of future generations. For millions of Japanese citizens hearing their emperor's actual voice for the first time in their lives, on a household radio, in language many of them found genuinely difficult to parse in real time, the practical meaning of the broadcast, that the war had ended, had to be explained to much of the country after the fact, by announcers and by word of mouth, rather than understood directly from the speech itself as it aired. There's a modern parallel worth drawing here, even though it feels almost inappropriate to say out loud. The dual voice broadcast stands as one of history's starkest examples of a communication event mattering as much as the decision behind it. The surrender had already been decided, twice, in imperial conferences on August 9th and 10th and again on August 14th, but none of that decision carried any force, politically or socially, until it reached the Japanese public directly, in the emperor's own voice, in a format nobody had ever heard before. It's the same principle behind why modern organizations, governments, companies, even sports leagues, treat the announcement of a major decision as functionally inseparable from the decision itself, because a decision nobody has heard cannot yet change anyone's behavior. For 12 hours on the night of August 14th into the 15th, Japan's surrender existed only as a decision. It became real, in a practical sense, only at noon the next day, over the radio. In the days that followed, the Guandong Army in Manchuria, still engaged against the ongoing Soviet offensive, was ordered to surrender on August 16th and 17th, though fighting continued in isolated pockets, including in the Kuril Islands, into early September. The formal end came on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, where Japanese representatives signed the instrument of surrender in front of General Douglas MacArthur, presiding as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. That signing arrived close to 3 weeks after the Emperor's broadcast had already ended the fighting for most practical purposes on the ground, and the gap between the dual voice broadcast on August 15th and the formal signing on September 2nd was itself taken up largely by the logistics of Allied forces actually arriving in Japan to receive that surrender in person, coordinating occupation planning, and finalizing exactly who from the Japanese government and military would be authorized to sign on the country's behalf. The war was over, both on paper aboard the Missouri and in practice, 17 days earlier, the moment Hirohito's recorded voice reached the Japanese public over the radio. Before moving into how historians have argued about all of this, it's worth laying the raw numbers next to each other directly, because most retellings never do. They cover Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, then the surrender, as 3 separate stories, without ever putting the death tolls in the same frame. The Tokyo firebombing of March 9th and 10th, 1945, a single night, using conventional incendiary bombs, no nuclear technology involved at all, killed somewhere between 80,000 and over 100,000 people and left close to 1 million homeless. Hiroshima, 5 months later, killed somewhere in the broad range of 70,000 to 166,000 people, depending on which source and which time frame you use, with the most cited epidemiological estimate landing around 140,000 dead by the end of 1945. Nagasaki killed somewhere between 60 and 80,000 in that same window, with a comparable epidemiological estimate around 74,000. Laid out that way, the single most destructive event of the entire war, by raw body count in one night, may actually have been the conventional Tokyo firebombing, not either atomic bombing. What made Hiroshima and Nagasaki categorically different wasn't necessarily that they killed more people than the worst conventional raids already had. It was that each city was destroyed by a single aircraft, carrying a single bomb, in a single instant, a ratio of destructive force to physical effort that had no precedent in the history of warfare, and that fundamentally changed what military planners on every side of every future conflict had to assume was now possible. Consider that ratio directly. The Tokyo raid required 279 separate bomber sorties, each aircraft carrying its own crew, fuel, and payload, coordinated across a single night, to inflict a death toll in the same broad range as what one aircraft, one bomb, and one crew produced over Hiroshima less than 5 months later. 279 aircraft for one outcome versus one aircraft for a comparable outcome. That single number is arguably the most consequential shift in the entire history of military strategy up to that point. More consequential in some ways than the raw death tolls themselves, because it's the shift that defined how every major power on Earth would plan for war for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Most documentaries on this subject either pick a side and pretend it's settled, or avoid the question entirely, and neither approach reflects where serious historical scholarship actually sits. This is one of the most contested questions in 20th century historiography, and the disagreement isn't between historians and conspiracy theorists. It's between credentialed historians, using largely the same archives, sometimes the exact same primary documents, and reaching genuinely different conclusions about what those documents actually prove. That's worth underlining before going any further, because it cuts against how this topic usually gets presented online, where it's often framed as a binary. Either the bombs saved 1 million lives by preventing an invasion, full stop, or the bombs were an unnecessary atrocity used purely to intimidate the Soviets, full stop. Neither of those two extremes is where the actual academic literature sits. The real debate is narrower, more technical, and in some ways more interesting than either extreme position, a disagreement over the relative weight of several genuine, documented, simultaneous pressures on Japan's government in early August of 1945, not a disagreement over whether those pressures existed at all. The traditional, or orthodox, position, argued most influentially by historian Richard Frank in his 1999 book Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, holds that the bombs were militarily necessary. Frank's case rests heavily on the fact that Japan's military leadership, the enemies at Toyota Bloc, never actually accepted surrender on their own initiative, at any point in the process this account has already walked through. It took a direct, almost unprecedented intervention by the emperor to force the decision, twice. First in the early hours of August 10th, and again on August 14th, and even then a group of officers tried to physically prevent that decision from ever reaching the public, murdering their own Imperial Guards commander in the process. Frank argues that the atomic bombs, layered on top of the empire's broader military collapse, the blockade, the firebombing, and now the Soviet invasion arriving in the same window, were what finally gave Hirohito the political cover to override his own military leadership in a way the Japanese constitutional system had never really anticipated an emperor needing to do. Frank also draws on the fact that Vice Chief of Staff Kawabe remained determined to continue the war even after the Nagasaki bombing on August 9th, evidence, in Frank's reading, that the military faction's resistance to surrender wasn't a bluff or a bargaining position but a genuine, sustained commitment to continued fighting that only the emperor's personal intervention was capable of overriding. Historians Robert Maddox and Wilson Miscamble also align with this general position, both having separately argued that without the shock of the bomb specifically, there's little concrete evidence the military faction would have relented as quickly, or possibly at all, given how entrenched their position remained right up through the 14th of August. Set against that is the revisionist position, most associated with historian Gar Alperovitz, first laid out in his 1965 book Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam, and expanded again 3 decades later in his 1995 book The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. Alperovitz argued that Japan was already close to surrender by the summer of 1945, and that the bombs were used less for military necessity and more as a signal to the Soviet Union, a form of atomic diplomacy meant to shape the post-war balance of power in Europe and Asia before Moscow could gain more ground, functionally using Hiroshima and Nagasaki as opening moves in what would become the Cold War rather than closing moves in World War II. Alperovitz's thesis was hugely influential during the Vietnam War era specifically, when American audiences were already primed by that separate, ongoing conflict to question official government justifications for the use of military force, a cultural moment that gave his argument far more traction than it might have found in, say, 1955. Historians like Robert Maddox and Wilson Miscamble have also heavily criticized that thesis as speculative and thin on direct documentary evidence that this diplomatic motive, rather than straightforward military necessity, was actually the decisive factor in Truman's mind at the moment he authorized the bombings. Their counterargument, in essence, is that Alperovitz worked backward from a Cold War outcome he already knew had happened, and then went looking for evidence that Truman had intended that outcome all along, a methodological trap historians call presentism, reading later history back into earlier decisions. The U.S. State Department's own historical office has noted that most scholars today accept that diplomatic considerations toward the Soviet Union played a role in the timing and framing of the decision, but dispute Alperovitz's stronger claim that the bombs were militarily unnecessary and used primarily, rather than incidentally, for that diplomatic purpose. Then there's a third position that reframes the entire question, from historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa. In his 2005 book Racing the Enemy, Stalin, Truman, and the Surrender of Japan, working from Japanese, Soviet, and American archives together, not just American sources, which is itself a meaningful methodological difference from most earlier scholarship on this question that had leaned heavily on U.S. government records because those were simply the most accessible to Western historians for decades. Hasegawa argues that the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, arriving in that same 72-hour window, was actually more decisive than either bomb. His logic runs like this. The bombs were terrible, but Japan's leadership had already weathered enormous conventional destruction, including a firebombing campaign that had killed more people in a single night over Tokyo than either atomic bomb killed immediately. If raw destructiveness alone were the deciding factor, Hasegawa's argument goes, Japan's government should arguably have already been moving toward surrender well before August 6th, given what Tokyo alone had already suffered in March. What changed specifically on August 8th and 9th wasn't the scale of destruction, it was the diplomatic map. What the Soviet invasion destroyed wasn't a city, it was Japan's last remaining diplomatic option. The hope of using a still neutral Moscow as an intermediary to negotiate a conditional peace rather than face unconditional surrender to the United States alone. Once that door closed, Hasegawa argues, Japan's leadership lost its last reason to keep stalling, regardless of how many cities had or hadn't already been destroyed. Scholars like John W. Dower and Richard Rhodes have found Hasegawa's multi-archival methodology persuasive even where they don't fully endorse every conclusion he draws from it, a sign that the debate isn't cleanly split into two opposing camps, but runs along multiple, overlapping fault lines depending on which specific claim within the broader argument is being evaluated. Hasegawa's thesis is itself disputed. Richard Frank has argued that trying to cleanly separate political causes from military causes misreads how the Big Six actually operated, since for them it wasn't Soviet entry versus atomic bombs as competing single causes, but a compounding collapse that only the emperor's direct intervention could resolve. Historian Sadao Asada has separately disputed Hasegawa's claim that the Japanese military was caught by complete surprise by Soviet entry, arguing instead that it was specifically the emperor's sacred decision, not the Soviet invasion on its own, that finally brought the military leadership to accept surrender. The Hasegawa versus Frank disagreement over Soviet entry is worth returning to with a bit more precision, because it's the fault line where the newest serious scholarship actually sits. Asada's rebuttal of Hasegawa isn't simply that Hasegawa is wrong. It's a specific factual challenge to one of Hasegawa's key claims, that Japan's military leadership was taken by complete surprise by the Soviet declaration of war. Asada's own archival work suggests Japan's leadership had, in fact, anticipated Soviet entry as a serious possibility for weeks beforehand, which, if correct, weakens Hasegawa's argument that the shock of Soviet betrayal specifically was what broke the deadlock, as opposed to the emperor's own, separate decision to intervene directly in a way he almost never had before. It's a genuinely technical historiographical dispute, resting on interpretation of Japanese-language military planning documents from the summer of 1945, and it hasn't been definitively resolved either way. There's a fourth data point that complicates all three positions. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, published in 1946, concluded that Japan would, in its own words, certainly have surrendered before December 31st, 1945, and probably before November 1st, even without the atomic bombs, without Soviet entry, and without any invasion, purely as a result of the blockade and conventional bombing already underway. That's a real, documented conclusion from an official U.S. government post-war study, produced by American analysts sent into Japan immediately after the surrender specifically to interview surviving Japanese leadership and assess what had actually driven their decision-making from the inside, rather than simply theorizing from Washington. That's also exactly where the survey's conclusion runs into its own contradictions. Military historian John Gentile has argued the survey overstated its own case in its final published summary, and that the raw interrogation evidence it collected actually undercuts the tidy conclusion it presented. Two specific data points stand out. Prince Kono, one of the figures interviewed as part of that same post-war survey process, stated that the war would probably have continued through the rest of 1945 regardless, directly at odds with the survey's own headline finding of a surrender certainly arriving before year's end. And Prime Minister Suzuki himself, the man who had chaired the deadlocked Big Six Council, acknowledged in his own post-war statements that the atomic bombing made a real and important difference to how and when the decision was actually reached. Gentile's argument, in short, is that the survey's authors had their conclusion largely settled before they finished processing their own evidence, an early example of a document reaching a cleaner, more citable conclusion than the Messier underlying interviews actually supported. The closest thing to a consensus middle ground answer comes from historian J. Samuel Walker, formerly the chief historian of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in his book Prompt and Utter Destruction. Walker's answer to whether the bomb was necessary is, deliberately, both yes and no. Yes, he argues, the bomb was necessary to end the war at the earliest possible moment. And yes, it likely saved American lives, probably numbering in the thousands. But no, he argues, the bomb was probably not necessary to end the war within a fairly short time frame, without any invasion of Japan at all. And no, it likely wasn't necessary to save hundreds of thousands of American lives, because the invasion that would have cost those lives may never have actually happened. Walker lists 5 separate reasons he believes actually drove Truman's decision, and it's worth naming all 5, since most retellings only mention the first: ending the war at the earliest possible moment, justifying the enormous cost of building the bomb in the first place, after Congress and the public had poured roughly $2 billion into a secret program that needed a visible result, gaining diplomatic leverage against a rising Soviet Union in the post-war order that was already taking shape even before Germany's surrender. The simple absence of any strong incentive not to use it, given that no serious voice inside the administration was arguing for restraint on moral or strategic grounds strong enough to override the first 3 reasons. And his 5th and most uncomfortable point: a documented current of hatred toward the Japanese and a desire for vengeance, built up over nearly 4 years of brutal Pacific fighting, that shaped the emotional environment in which the decision was made, even if it wasn't the primary driver on paper. Walker's revised editions of the book placed increasing weight on the Soviet invasion of Manchuria as a contributing factor in convincing Hirohito to act, a shift that shows even within a single historian's body of work. The balance of the argument has moved over time as more archival evidence, particularly from Soviet and Japanese sources, became available to Western scholars. One more piece of this story deserves scrutiny, because it's quoted constantly and understood correctly almost never. After the Trinity test succeeded, Oppenheimer later recalled, in a 1965 television interview, decades after the fact, that a line from the Bhagavad Gita came to mind. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It's become the single most quoted sentence in the entire history of nuclear weapons, used in documentaries, films, and books as the defining emotional artifact of the atomic age. But even Oppenheimer's own brother, Frank, who was standing beside him at Trinity, recalled that in the actual moment, Oppenheimer said something far less poetic. Simply, it worked. The Gita line was a recollection assembled decades later for television about how he says he felt, not a transcript of what he said in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945. The translation itself is looser than it's usually presented to, since the Sanskrit word rendered as death in that quote, kala, more precisely translates to time. It's a small distinction, but it matters, because the myth of Oppenheimer immediately grasping the full moral weight of what he'd built, in real time, standing in the desert, is more cinematic than what the historical record actually supports. None of these historians dispute the raw facts of what happened in those 72 hours. They dispute what those facts mean, and which one of several converging pressures, 2 bombs, 1.5 million Soviet soldiers, a starving population, and a fractured government, actually broke the deadlock. As Walker himself put it, the controversy over Truman's decision seems certain to continue. That's not evasion. That's an accurate description of where serious historical scholarship on this question actually stands 80 years later. The immediate physical destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has already been described in detail in this account. The casualty ranges, the destroyed square kilometers, the radiation studies. What's less often covered is what happened to the survivors, and to the story itself, in the 80 years since. Roughly 650,000 people have, over time, been officially recognized as hibakusha, and that population is now extremely old and shrinking fast. As of Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare figures from March of 2025, the officially registered hibakusha population fell below 100,000 for the first time, 99,130 people, with an average age of 86.13 years. A more recent update, from July of 2026, puts the number at 91,105, a drop of over 8,000 in a single year, with the average age now approaching 87. Look at that decline as a trend line rather than a single snapshot, and the urgency behind current memorialization efforts becomes clearer. In the space of 1 year, from March 2025 to July 2026, Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare recorded the registered hibakusha population dropping from 99,130 to 91,105, a loss of 8,025 people in roughly 16 months. With the average age of the remaining survivors climbing from 86.13 to 86.66 years old. At that rate of decline, the population of people who can speak to what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki firsthand, as opposed to through archives, museums, or secondhand testimony, is on a clear and fairly short trajectory toward zero. That's part of why 2024's Nobel Peace Prize, and the accompanying wave of testimony collection and documentation efforts around it, arrived when it did rather than a decade earlier or later, a recognition that the living memory window on this event is closing in real time. In October of 2024, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Nihon Hidankyo, the Japan Confederation of A and H-bomb sufferers organizations, a grassroots hibakusha advocacy group founded in 1956, for what the Nobel Committee described as its efforts toward a world free of nuclear weapons, achieved specifically through decades of survivor witness testimony. It was the 141st Nobel Peace Prize awarded, carrying a cash award of roughly $1 million. Co-chair Toshiyuki Mamaki reacted to the announcement with visible surprise, and co-chair Terumi Tanaka delivered the Nobel lecture in Oslo that December, calling on nuclear-armed states to sign the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that, notably, none of the world's existing nuclear powers have signed. August of 2025 marked the 80th anniversary of the bombings. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Ceremony that year drew what's been described as a record level of international representation, approximately 55,000 attendees, including survivors, bereaved family members, and official representatives from 120 nations, the European Union, and the United Nations. In his message that year, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned that the risk of nuclear conflict was, in his assessment, growing rather than shrinking 80 years on. 120 nations formally represented. That figure is itself a data point worth sitting with against the ceremony's earlier history. A gathering of that scale, drawing official government representation from well over half the countries on Earth to mark the anniversary of a wartime attack on a single city, has no real precedent among other anniversary commemorations tied to individual World War II events. It reflects both the unique, singular place Hiroshima and Nagasaki continue to occupy in the collective memory of the 20th century, and a specific renewed urgency in 2025, with active nuclear-armed conflict risk cited directly by the UN's own Secretary-General in his remarks that year, that gave the 80th anniversary a weight beyond simple historical commemoration. In Nagasaki, on August 9, 2025, something happened that hadn't happened since 1945. The two bells of Urakami Cathedral rang together again. One bell had been destroyed in the bombing and never replaced. A restoration campaign led by an American sociology professor, James Nolan Jr., whose own grandfather had served as chief medical officer at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, raised exactly $125,000 from 628 individual donors, mostly American Catholics, over roughly 16 months. The restored bell, named the St. Kateri Bell of Hope, was blessed in July of 2025 and rung publicly for the first time on the anniversary, at 11:02 in the morning, the exact minute of the original detonation. Russia was invited to attend Nagasaki's ceremony for the first time since its 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Sit with the specific detail of who led that restoration campaign, because it's not incidental. James Nolan Jr.'s grandfather wasn't a distant historical footnote to this story. He served, in a direct medical capacity, inside the Manhattan Project itself, the same program that produced the bomb which destroyed the cathedral's original bell in the first place. 80 years later, his grandson raised the funds, dollar by dollar, from over 600 individual American donors, to restore that same building's second bell and let it ring again on the exact anniversary, at the exact minute. It's a rare instance of a story closing a loop across 3 generations, from a scientist inside the weapons construction to his grandson funding the physical repair of something that weapon destroyed, timed to the minute of the original blast. Both cities preserved physical evidence of what happened to them, deliberately, rather than fully rebuilding over it. Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park includes the Genbaku Dome, the skeletal ruin of a building that stood nearly beneath the blast hypocenter and was left standing, intentionally, as a ruin rather than demolished or restored, and later designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, alongside the memorial cenotaph and the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum itself. Nagasaki's own Peace Park includes its Peace Statue and the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum, documenting the bombing and its aftermath for visitors in a way deliberately parallel to Hiroshima's institutions, even though Nagasaki has historically received less international attention than Hiroshima despite its own devastating toll. Both cities' museums, along with the Radiation Effects Research Foundation's ongoing lifespan study, a research effort that has now tracked its cohort of over 100,000 survivors across more than 7 decades, continue functioning today as the primary institutional memory of what happened. That combination of physical preservation, survivor testimony, and long-running epidemiological research amounts to a 3-layered archive. What the cities looked like, what the people who lived through it experienced, and what happened to their bodies and their descendants' health over the following decades. As the number of people who can testify to any of it firsthand keeps shrinking every year, that 3-layered archive is increasingly what future audiences will be left with instead of living memory. The historical debate hasn't gone quiet either. Historian M. G. Scheftel's 2024 book Hiroshima. The Last Witnesses collects survivor testimony directly, and Scheftel has argued publicly that the bombs functioned less as a mechanical trigger that forced Japan's surrender and more as something that gave Emperor Hirohito the political opportunity to make a decision he may have already been inclined toward. That framing, bombs as opportunity rather than pure mechanism, sits closer to Frank's traditionalist reading than to Hasegawa's Soviet entry thesis, a reminder that this argument is still actively being written, not settled, even in scholarship published within the last 2 years. Public interest in the underlying decision-making was renewed sharply in 2023 with the release of Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer, which pushed Manhattan Project history back into mainstream conversation for an audience that may never have otherwise encountered Groves, the Interim Committee, or the Target Committee's internal debates at all. That renewed public attention has, in turn, fed directly into projects like Scheftel's survivor testimony work and the wave of 80th anniversary coverage and ceremonies in 2025, a reminder that popular culture and serious historiography aren't operating in separate lanes here. A 3-hour biographical film about a physicist, released for entertainment, demonstrably widened the audience for exactly the kind of primary source survivor testimony and archival historical debate this account has been drawing on throughout. 2 bombs. 1.5 million Soviet soldiers crossing into Manchuria within hours of each other. A 6-man council split 3-3. An emperor forced, twice, into a decision his own constitution never really intended him to make alone. A coup that came apart in a single night because a handful of officers couldn't find a set of hidden recordings in time. Historians still don't agree on which of those pressures actually ended the war: the bombs, the Soviet invasion, the blockade that had already been strangling Japan for months, or simply an emperor finally willing to say what his generals couldn't. Richard Frank points to the emperor's direct intervention as the hinge point. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa points to the closing of Japan's last diplomatic option when Soviet tanks crossed into Manchuria. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's own authors pointed to the blockade and conventional bombing campaign already grinding Japan toward collapse regardless of what happened in August at all. J. Samuel Walker looked at all three and concluded the honest answer is yes and no, that no single thread fully explains what happened, because no single thread was acting alone. What almost none of them dispute is this: right up until the very last hours, Japan's surrender was not inevitable, was not unanimous, and was not guaranteed to happen the way it did. A council of 6 men, evenly split, needed an emperor to break a tie he was never constitutionally supposed to have to break. A recording of that decision very nearly never reached the public at all, and came apart by the accident of one regional army command declining to join a coup. 2 entirely different bomb designs, one of them never before tested on anything, were built in parallel because nobody was sure either one would actually work. A city was spared because one man argued hard enough with his own general, and a second city was hit not because it was the plan, but because clouds and smoke obscured the first target for 50 minutes and a bomber was running out of fuel. 80 years later, with fewer than 100,000 of the people who lived through it still alive to say so, that's still the part of the story worth sitting with. Not that the war ended, which everyone already knows, but how close, at almost every single step along the way, it came to ending differently.